Welcome to Lecture 12 on the Confession of Belhar. This will be the final confession that we look at in this course on Reformed theology. And like Barman, Belhar is also a response to a socio-political crisis, a status confessionis. And in the case of Belhar, the crisis in question was a situation of apartheid in South Africa. Much like the German Christians, the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa was rooted in the white supremacist notion of a natural hierarchy of the races, with the white race being superior. Whereas in Germany, there was a new empire trying to play catch up on the world stage. The situation in South Africa was a result of an old empire now long past its prime and dealing with the consequences of its sins. In this lecture, I'm going to unpack the history behind this situation of apartheid and then look at the Belhar Confession as the response to it by the church. So let's go back first to the origins of the Dutch Reformed Church, since all this is important as part of the larger setup for how we get to the situation in South Africa. So first, in 1559, Guido de Brès, a student of John Calvin in Geneva, wrote a confession of faith of 37 articles based on Calvin's French confession from the same year. It was printed in French in 1561, and it became known as the Belgic Confession. At the time, Belgica was a Latin term referring to the whole territory that's now split into Belgium and the Netherlands. So that's why it's called the Belgic Confession. It was printed in Dutch in 1562. Now, due to persecution from Spanish Catholic leaders, a synod of Dutch churches gathered in Germany in 1566 to revise the Belgic Confession and mount an opposition to Spain. They modified the article on the church and state, and that set in place the theological foundation for the future state of the Netherlands. And that was then later proclaimed in 1581 following the Dutch Revolt. And that's all part of why the Dutch and the Reformed Church are so interwoven. The state of the Netherlands was rooted in Dutch Reformed theology from the outset. Now, the Belgic Confession was adopted by the Dutch churches at synods held in 1568, 1578. There was a number of different synods that happened during this period of time, all of which established the Dutch Reformed Church, gave it a foundation, and that got the ball rolling there for the Netherlands being a Protestant state. Jumping ahead a little bit, the Second Synod of Dort, simply called mostly the Synod of Dort, and that's the most famous one, was held in 1618 to 1619. We already talked about this briefly in looking back at the history of Westminster. But this synod, which I'll just say a little bit more about again, that's where the Dutch Reformed leaders expelled the followers of Arminius, known as the Remonstrants, from the church. And it's important to recognize that this debate over election and God's sovereignty, all that happened in the Dutch church. Jacobus Arminius, or Jacob Arminius, was a Dutch theologian who provoked controversy for recommending revision to both the Belgic Confession and the Heidelberg Catechism. And the Synod of Dort reveals how important the question of divine sovereignty and double predestination were in the minds of the Dutch Reformed Church. We often associate those ideas with Westminster and later American Presbyterianism, which of course they were very important for those communities and contexts, but it originated in the Dutch church in the Netherlands. And that's important for the larger theological climate atmosphere of Reformed theology in the Dutch church. The Synod of Dort established what are known as the three forms of unity: the Belgic Confession, the Canons of Dort, and the Heidelberg Catechism. And these are still the standards today for all the Dutch Reformed churches. So if you go to a Dutch Reformed church, church descended from the Dutch Reformed community, these will be the items that they will be most familiar with theologically. Jumping ahead in time, much later, the Dutch Reformed theologian Abraham Kuyper became the prime minister of the Netherlands from 1901 to 1905. He was a very important figure, which we don't have time to go into, but in the story at least. But he led the anti-revolutionary party, the ARP, which was in power for about 30 to 40 years. He founded the Free University of Amsterdam. He also founded a denomination, the Reformed Churches in the Netherlands. And probably most significantly for us today, he initiated the movement of Neo-Calvinism, which is a movement of theology rooted in the Dutch Reformed tradition, but with some more modern twists to it. And that's now largely synonymous with Dutch Reformed theology today. All of this then leads us to a couple takeaways from what we can learn about this, about the Dutch Reformed Church and the Netherlands. First, the Netherlands were intimately and are intimately connected to Dutch Reformed theology. To be Dutch was to be Reformed, and that's a crucial part of the story for South Africa. Secondly, the Dutch Reformed were particularly interested in questions of election and creation, God's order of all things, God's sovereignty in determining the way things will be or ought to be. Okay, so that and that issue of election, it connected also to their being Dutch. So being Dutch Europeans was connected for Dutch Reformed Church to their election, to their being chosen by God. So all that helps to kind of bring together theology and politics and culture and how deeply interwoven they are to the people of Holland. So the country of the Netherlands, the Dutch, had one of the largest and most powerful empires in history, thanks to the corporate and colonial power of the Dutch West India Company and the Dutch East India Company. And this is where the story becomes especially important and significant for South Africa. So I want to show a map here of the colonies. So this shows you where these Dutch companies had control, and where the colonies that they started. So you see the dark green here are the ones that were from the West India Company, and the light green are the East India. And the orange dots are trading outposts, which are numerous. But you see among these, one of these places is South Africa, and I'm going to get to that in a moment. But just so you have it in mind, the scale and scope of this empire, this shows you just how significant, how important the Dutch were in the global imperial map. So the Dutch East India Company founded a colony at the Cape of Good Hope in 1652 as a resupply way station between Europe and Asia. Now it's important to understand, so these companies operated from the early 1600s until the end of the 18th century, around 1800. They all helped kind of lay the foundation for the creation of the Kingdom of the Netherlands that then took over the colonial operations in 1815. So in terms of the Cape of Good Hope, Dutch immigration to South Africa had largely ceased by 1700. The few thousand Dutch settlers who had come to that place, they remained and became known as the Boers, the farmers. These were Dutch Reformed Christians who identified Christian faith with their white European heritage. The Boers viewed themselves as God's chosen elect in the midst of a godless world. And they viewed the indigenous Bushmen as savage heathen who were rejected by God. The Boers carefully guarded the purity of their community, and they refused to engage with those that they saw as foreign and unclean. The Boers are the precursors for what would later become known as the Afrikaner people, whose distinct dialect of Dutch was called Afrikaans. And so that will become important later on as we move forward in the story. So the British took over the Cape Colony during the Napoleonic Wars. And as a result of that, British settlers came to South Africa in the late 18th century, early 19th century. They first occupied the Cape in 1795 to 1803, and then they fully took control beginning in 1806, ratified in 1815, and that lasted until 1961. So there's a long period here of British occupation and rule in South Africa. The British did not share the Boers' sharp distinction between themselves and the heathen others. And in 1833, the British outlawed slavery. That act offended the Boers, who viewed the notion that all people are equal as something contrary to the law of God. As a result of this tension the British, of course, were also violent and had a really their rule of this land was bloody and full of authoritarianism. But in addition to that, there was an ideological disagreement between the British and the Boers. And as a result of that, the Boers left the colony in the 1830s in what was called, not all of them, but some of them left the colony in what was called the Great Trek. As one Afrikaner put it, we withdrew in order to preserve our doctrines in purity. And you can see in that map there, where they settled. They went north and often west, and they formed these new republics. And some of those, such as the Natalia Republic and the Orange Free State, had a significant population and a role in later South African politics. These new Afrikaner republics flourished, but they turned out to be sitting on vast deposits of diamond and gold. And as a result of that, the British Empire wanted to take them and take those resources for themselves. And that resulted in the British Empire launching a war in 1899 to 1902 against the Boers, a bloody war to claim this wealth for themselves. And those wars eventually resulted in those republics becoming integrated into the larger South African territory, and it just instigated the further antagonism between the Boers and the British. And I want to shift now to talk about the church context here in South Africa. So as the official church of a colonial power, the DRC, or the Dutch Reformed Church, would plant churches in the colonies of the Dutch Empire. That was just part of their job. Wherever the empire went, wherever these companies went, they would plant churches for the settlers. And so today there is the Dutch Reformed Church in Botswana. There's the DRC in Namibia. There's a DRC in Central Africa, the DRC of Suriname, the DRC in Brazil, and there's also the DRC in South Africa. So in South Africa, the main Dutch church is the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa. The abbreviation in Afrikaans is NGK. And the church was established by Jan van Riebeek in 1652. And that was the main Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa for the white Dutch settlers. But there were other churches as well. The two other denominations are the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa, the NHK, and which was a smaller denomination for the more rural Afrikaner population. And then also the Reformed churches in South Africa, the RCSA, a splinter church that broke off from the NHK in 1859 over a doctrinal disagreement about a new hymn book. So these Reformed churches were established for Dutch settlers, and they were closely tied to the Boers, or the Afrikaner people. Moving ahead into the 19th century, by the late 19th century, there was the missionary movement that was starting to sweep across all of Europe and And that missionary movement was influencing these major Protestant denominations, both in Europe and North America, to encourage them to plant new churches and to spread the gospel to indigenous peoples who had not heard of Christianity. And this, when this spread through, it compelled the Dutch Reformed Church to start mission churches for the non-white population. Various revival movements began evangelizing in South Africa and starting new churches, and that motivated the NGK to form their own mission churches. Now, the problem with all that was that the Boers were absolutely opposed to having non-white Africans be part of their church. They were still fully committed to the view that non-white people were heathens, rejected by God, and did not think that they were equal to the Dutch people in dignity. So the solution was, of course, to have segregated churches. In 1859, the NGK established the Dutch Reformed Church in Africa, the DRCA, for Black South Africans. A couple of years earlier than that, the NGK had begun to have separate services for those categorized as colored, which was a legal term for people of mixed ethnicity. But by 1881, they established that as a separate church, the Dutch Reformed Mission Church, the DRMC. So you have a church for Black South Africans and then a church for colored or mixed South Africans. And both of these were modeled on the model of the NGK, the white church, but they were also structurally dependent upon the white church. And ultimately, they were dependent upon the Dutch Reformed Church, DRC, in the Netherlands as their authoritative body. And that created a relationship of dependence in which the non-white churches had to be subservient and subordinate to the white church. And this same relation of racial inequality and inequity existed in South African society more generally due to centuries of colonial rule, first by the Dutch and later by the British. And all of this had its roots in German theology and mission theory. Some of this I talked about with respect to Barman, and we kind of go back into that a little bit more. So, like the German Christians, the Dutch Reformed Christianity in South Africa grounded its approach to the church in the concept of the folk, the ethno-national people. The Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa saw itself as a volkskerk, for the Afrikaner folk, just as the German Christians saw themselves as a German evangelical church, as a Volkskirche for the Aryan folk. Just as a point of the linguistics, the German language capitalizes its nouns, whereas Dutch does not. So that's why folk is lowercase for the Afrikaner, but it's capitalized for the German Aryan folk. But it's the same term, same basic idea, rooted in the same theology. So likewise, the mission work of the Dutch NGK was rooted in German mission theory. The German theologians who pioneered the study of mission in the late 19th century rooted mission in the concept of the folk. Each mission church should be a distinct Volkskirche, distinct church of the people, the church of the ethno-national group. So there should be a distinct Volkskirche for each particular ethnic group. So in their missionary efforts, the Germans and later the Dutch, they were strongly emphatic that each church should be for a specific ethnic group. And in this mentality, the Germans rejected the Anglo-American approach to mission, which posited a universal colorblind church, as if ethnic and racial differences were irrelevant and invisible to God. Now, of course, that mentality is also what made Anglo-American Christianity so racially insidious. A colorblind Christianity ignores the racist structures and policies of society. And such a church will only end up supporting the racial and racist status quo, because it will not see racial injustice as something relevant to the gospel. Indeed, it will not see racial injustice at all. It's intentionally blind to all of that. So the Germans rejected that. They rejected the colorblind or the universalist approach of the Anglo-Americans. But the Germans, but in rejecting that, they went to the other extreme by making each church a church for a particular ethnic or racial group or folk. It segregated the church into separate communities, each wholly confined to their own racial community. So German mission theologians talked about the importance of contextualizing the church for specific people. Now, the Germans were right in that. They were right to emphasize contextualization. The problem was not their method, but so much as the content of contextualization. By choosing ethnic and racial categories as the basis for contextualization, they ended up reinforcing and strengthening the racist divisions and inequities in society. There are other ways to contextualize the gospel for a particular place and time that had nothing to do with race and ethnicity. So the choice of that is what was problematic about the German approach. And that's what led also to the Dutch church embracing that particular kind of view. So the Dutch church's missionary work was rooted in the same racist theory that lay behind the German Christian idea of an Aryan church of the people. Just as the German Christians believed that the German church should be the white church in distinction from the churches of other nations, so too the Dutch Christians believed in that the NGK should be the white church, while the DRMC should be the colored church and the DRCA should be the black church. Each of these would be a distinct Volkskirche. So systemic inequity was built into the theology and practice of Reformed Christianity in South Africa. And the result was an apartheid church and an apartheid society, apartheid being the Afrikaans word for separateness. That brings us to the issue of apartheid itself. So the scandal of apartheid. So apartheid began in the church and then became established in the government. This is something that's important to point out and remember as we look at South Africa and the situation there. What began as segregated churches with the white church holding the power became segregated sectors of society with white society holding the power. This began really, things got in motion in particular. The movement from church to society happened around 1914 when the Afrikaners created the National Party, the NP, as a political vehicle for asserting Afrikaner identity. The NP was heavily connected to the Dutch Reformed Church. As historian Alec Ryrie observed, the NP was very close to being the Dutch Reformed Church under another guise. It became routine to joke that the only difference between the NP and the DRC was a day of the week. The Afrikaners formed their political party to oppose the British who ruled the territory. The British Empire advocated a non-racial liberal melting pot, as I pointed out, the kind of colorblind capitalist society that took hold in the United States. But for the Afrikaners, this vision of society was nothing less than an attack on their distinct God-given national identity. The Afrikaners viewed themselves as a separate folk from the native Black and colored population. These were separate nations in their mind, with their own separate place within the hierarchical order of God's creation, the white Afrikaners on top, of course. And to mix them together would be to contaminate both. So it was therefore God's will to keep the different communities segregated. At the same time that the Afrikaners were beginning to mobilize politically, the British establishment abandoned their efforts to establish a non-racial state, and they acquiesced and accepted the racial hierarchy advocated by the Afrikaners. The governing party at the time called this the Christian trusteeship of the European race over the natives. So, and much like Jim Crow in the United States, the legal rights of the non-white population were increasingly restricted. Beginning in 1929, Dutch Reformed Christians began to use the word apartheid to describe the state of affairs. Initially, this was in reference to the separate white and colored churches, but later it became a description for society as a whole. Church leaders and theologians argued that separation was morally superior to the status quo of simple discrimination and exploitation. Professors of Reformed theology in South Africa developed the theory of apartheid based on the belief that the different ethnic nations within South Africa should be kept pure and separate from each other. And one of their demands was a ban on interracial marriage. In 1931, the DRC and the Orange Free State called for Black churches to be separated and apart from white communities. Later in 1948, the National Party ran on a platform of apartheid, and they won enough votes that they were able to control parliament. And they remained in power until 1994. So that vote in 1948 was a pivotal moment that really set in place the establishment of the policies that became apartheid. And once they got control of the territory with parliament, they quickly began to enact their legislation. So National Party leaders created the Bantustans, or the Bantu homelands, which was a territory where all Black South Africans were forcefully relocated. The white political leaders stripped Black South Africans of their citizenship, and they made them citizens instead of this new land in order to keep them separate from the white population. 1949, white politicians passed the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act, followed by the Immorality Amendment Act of 1950, outlined respectively the interracial marriages and sexual relationships between white and Black or mixed race people. The following year, they passed the Population Registration Act, which classified all South Africans into one of 4 racial categories: white, Black, coloreds, and Indian. Places of residence were then determined by one's racial classification. So which category you fell into determined where your home was going to be. And over the next few decades, over 3.5 million Black Africans were removed from their homes and relocated to segregated neighborhoods. Non-whites were largely banned from owning land. That's just a bit about what apartheid involved. Of course, things developed further beyond that, but I want to pause for a moment to compare apartheid to Jim Crow in the US and Nazi Germany, to understand a little bit more about what makes this situation distinct. So South Africa is often compared to both the USA and Germany, and for good reason. South Africa created segregated neighborhoods. So, like both US and Germany, there were neighborhoods where people were, those who considered themselves white were in one place, and those who were considered non-white were placed in another place. Likewise, in both US and Germany, South Africa also established laws that subordinated and disenfranchised the non-white population. And like both of those, South Africa also viewed this racialized hierarchy as a reflection of God's will. All of these were thus in various ways caste societies using the framework of Isabel Wilkerson. But there are some important differences as well, which I want to take note of. So first, looking at Jim Crow. Jim Crow flourished in the US because of the US's commitment to a colorblind liberal democracy and a federalist form of government that privileged local state control. The US is a capitalist democracy that primarily only cares about people's equality as consumers, not as whole persons. The US has historically thus had a hands-off approach to social matters in some cases. And except in special situations, it has not regarded racial inequity and other social inequities to be in conflict with democratic principles. That's, of course, increasingly changing, but part of what's important here is that when discrepancies and tensions were recognized, the US has seen social equality as something that will be eventually achieved when it is convenient for the white majority. So the US has this progressive vision of itself as always improving, and it thus appeals to a future in which more and more people will experience equality, but at a gradual pace that remains comfortable to the systems of power. So the point there is that it's fundamentally primarily a colorblind liberal democracy that does not focus on issues of these kinds of larger social injustices, but it has this progressive vision that will eventually realize these things in the future. Okay, that's the US. By contrast, the racist policies that flourished in Nazi Germany did so because of a totalitarian system of government that intentionally orchestrated its segregated and oppressive society. While there was indeed extensive anti-Judaism and anti-Jewish prejudice among the German people, ultimately the mass deportation and murder of those deemed unwanted and untouchable were carried out by design of the government. It wasn't done despite the government's principles, as in the case of the US, but because of them. The government regime used the churches for its benefit, but it was otherwise a wholly secular program rooted in racist conspiracy theories and especially the imperial lust for land and resources. Okay, that's Nazi Germany. Now, in distinction from both of these, South Africa was neither a liberal democracy promoting progress, nor a totalitarian government dictating policies for the benefit of an imperial state. In distinction from both of those, the Afrikaner rejected non-racial liberal democracy because that was the view of the British, whom they hated. There were, however, some in South Africa who did express solidarity with the Nazis. In the 1930s, a fascist Afrikaner movement began called the Oxwagon Sentinel. And they openly supported Germany in World War II, and they called for Nazi-like policies to be implemented in South Africa to protect the concerns of the Afrikaner. But, and this is crucial, the National Party Afrikaner shut down the South African Nazis, but not because they disagreed with the racist policies and ideas. The issue was that Nazi-style racism lumped all white people together as a superior race. Remember, blood and soil, all of that Aryanism, right? The problem for the Afrikaner was that they didn't believe all white people were superior. They thought only they were superior, only the Dutch settlers who were God's chosen elect, the chosen few in the godless world. A Nazi-style racism would have lumped the Dutch settlers with the British together as the superior race, but the Afrikaner hated the British. So that's why that was the problem with the fascist Afrikaner, that they were undermining this key principle of Afrikaner apartheid. That is, it's not just the white people, but Dutch white people who were, the chosen people in the world. So the Afrikaner nationalists wanted a state founded on what they called the eternal legal principles of the Word of God, as understood in Dutch Reformed theology. They didn't base their nationalism on a generic whiteness, which could apply to other non-Dutch, non-Reformed white people. It was specifically for Dutch Reformed white people. And for that reason, Alec Ryrie has pointed out that apartheid was a form not of fascism, but of Calvinism. That fact is central both to its creation and to its dissolution. Really important point that I want to highlight here. So having said that, let's look a little bit more at Reformed theology and how it justified and supported apartheid. And I want to compare that first by looking at how theology was used in Nazi Germany as a point of contrast. So in Nazi Germany, Lutheran theology offered support for the Nazi regime and German Christian ideology. And here, a key point was the Lutheran doctrine of the two kingdoms, which was used to justify allowing the Nazi state to do whatever it wanted politically. Along with that, there was the German notion of the Volkskirche, which was used to justify remaking the church as a white-only institution for the German folk. So that's the 2 points for the Nazi theology that we've discussed with respect to Barman. In South Africa, the situation is very similar, but there's a distinctly reformed flavor and twist to it. So first, Dutch Reformed theology provided a robust doctrine of creation that differentiated between different orders or spheres. The Dutch Reformed and also the later Neo-Calvinists, so Kuyper here is a part of this role, right? So Kuyper's theology gets underway in the early 20th century, and that has an important place in all this. And Kuyper strongly emphasized issues of creation and different spheres. And he coined the term sphere sovereignty to define this. So the Dutch Reformed or Neo-Calvinist doctrine of sphere sovereignty functioned a lot like the Lutheran two kingdoms doctrine, except that instead of two kingdoms, they had multiple spheres, including education, economy, family, art. Each sphere had its own norms and authorities. The Dutch Reformed theology assumes that God divinely ordains these different spheres, including the laws and orders and hierarchies associated with them. So there's no distinction here between culture and religion. Religion exists to bless and strengthen the orders of life in Dutch society. And so that's important. It's related to the Lutheran point, but whereas the Lutherans, segregated and divided church and state and kind of left the state to do what it wanted. Here is actually a grounding of the state, a grounding of its orders and policies and hierarchies in a larger theology of creation. So there's a closer connection here within the Reformed situation between their theology and their politics. Dutch Reformed theology also, like the German Christian situation, they also strongly emphasize cultural particularity in its conception of theology in the church. Reformed theology from the start has always emphasized the distinctiveness of different geographical locations. So we have Heidelberg for Germany, the second Helvetic Confession for Switzerland, the Belgic Confession for the Netherlands. So you have this interest in different geographical locations and the different people that belong to each of those places. The Dutch Reformed theology, like the German Christian theology of the folk, defined cultural particularity in specifically racialized terms. So the folk was not merely geographical, but it became ethnic, racial, and cultural. That's the twist that occurred within modern German and Dutch theology that really provided a core part of their theological justification for their policies, their racist policies. And this emphasis on ethnic and racial diversity can be a positive thing within, so long as it's within a larger agreement on the equality of all people. But the Dutch Reformed Church had no such prior agreement. And they didn't think all people were equal. So in the absence of any universal equality, their theological emphasis on diversity and distinct spheres led to a racialized hierarchy and an enforced segregation. And the result of all of that was a reformed theology of apartheid. Turning now to the unraveling of this regime. So there was resistance to apartheid from the start of the National Party's control of South Africa. In 1949, there were protests by a group of Black nationalists called the African National Congress, the ANC, arguing for the overthrow of white power through strikes and boycotts. In 1959, Black nationalists formed the Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC. A PAC protest in 1960 in the town of Sharpeville resulted in 69 people being killed by the police in what became known as the Sharpeville Massacre. The government then declared a state of emergency, and they arrested over 18,000 people, as well as banned both the ANC and the PAC. And this was the scandal that brought apartheid to global awareness. Members of the ANC and PAC then called for negotiations in the following year and threatened to protest and strike if they were ignored. The protesters were then swiftly arrested, including one of the organizers, Nelson Mandela. In the 1970s, the Black consciousness movement arose, influenced by the civil rights movement in the United States and the Black Pride movement and the Black Power. And so they sought to instill Black pride and Black power in Black South Africans. The government cracked down on them and beat their leader to death. In 1976, then, a group of students in Soweto protested the fact that Afrikaans was the only language for instruction. On June 16, 1976, police opened fire on a group of students protesting peacefully, with a number of dead ranging anywhere from 176 to 700, though the official number was 23. Thousands more were injured. You can see a picture there, the famous image that was shown throughout the world after that terrible massacre. And this act was the final straw that led to the breaking of the apartheid regime. Of course, the response of the world was slow, as is often the case. Following the Sharpeville massacre, the UN called for an end to racial discrimination in 1960, and then they condemned apartheid in 1962. The World Council of Churches met with South African churches in 1960. That resulted in the Coatslow Declaration that named racial segregation, separation, antithetical to the gospel. White DRC or white NGK churches began to resign from the World Council of Churches because they strongly supported apartheid, and other white churches were suspended from membership. 1977, following the massacre, the Lutheran World Federation declared apartheid a heresy. That was followed in 1982 by the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, which suspended the white DRC churches from membership. That same year, in response to all of this, the biracial and Black DRMC, DRCA gathered at Belhar, not far from Cape Town, for their annual synod. Along with the World Lutheran and Reformed organizations, the DRMC declared apartheid a status confessionis, a crisis that calls into question the confession of their common faith, and thus demands a response. The result of all that was the Belhar Confession, which was eventually adopted in 1986. Alongside these events, politically, in 1983, anti-apartheid leaders formed the United Democratic Front, UDF. This group included Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Between 87 and 93, the National Party negotiated with the ANC about ending apartheid. And finally, in 1990, Mandela and other ANC leaders were released from prison. Apartheid legislation was repealed in 1991 and confirmed with new multiracial elections for the first time in 1994. And that brings us to the Belhar Confession. So as the DRMC letter that is included with the confession says, this confession was a cry from the heart. It's a statement of desperation and crisis coming from people afraid for their lives and facing systemic injustice. The confession is directed not against white people, but against a false doctrine that threatens the gospel itself in our church and our country. I want to compare this with C67 briefly, since this is another statement that we have that addresses racism. So that confession, which as you may recall, discusses racism, but it does so in the context of a section on the social implications of its theology of reconciliation. C67 focuses on the barriers, as it says, the barriers between people that stem from personal discrimination based on race. Now, Belhar differs from C67 in the way that it identifies structural injustice and systemic racism as a theological problem. It addresses the theological arguments that support racism directly, and then develops a specifically anti-racist theology. So because of the way that apartheid racism was justified and supported by Dutch Reformed theology, Belhar recognizes in a special way that anti-racism has to be grounded in our fundamental theological convictions. And so the approach and the focus of the theology of Belhar is different. It doesn't just put anti-racism in a context of consequences, but it grounds it positively in the gospel itself. So the extreme situation in South Africa exposed a truth for all Christians, and therefore speaks beyond that situation to something that's true about theology more generally. Now, I want to say a little bit more about the structural dimension here regarding racism, because one of the important points that Belhar kind of touches on is the fact that racism is not primarily a matter of individual prejudice or individual acts of bigotry or discrimination. C67 has a more individual approach to it. Doesn't quite highlight the structural dimension. So racism is not just prejudice, but it's prejudice plus power. And that power dimension is embedded in policies and social hierarchies and institutions that unequally distribute political power, resources, and security. So these structural inequities sustain the oppression of racial minorities and other underprivileged groups. And that includes, for instance, the way, say, redlining and other predatory practices have preyed on Black families and prevented them from being able to buy homes in desirable neighborhoods. And on top of that, property taxes in those neighborhoods go on to fund the local public schools, which ensure that schools in white neighborhoods will continue to receive more resources. Now, on top of all that, you have policing practices, police training, being trained to patrol more in Black neighborhoods and to use broken window policing practices to guarantee that they'll find more people to arrest. And that's just some of the many examples of how the racial caste system in the US operates and why a theological response to it requires more than just a message of racial reconciliation. We need a theology, an anti-racist theology that addresses the larger structural and systemic nature of the system. Now, while Belhar is not a complete program by any means for how to address racism theologically or within the church, it is unique in the way that it identifies the theological crisis posed by structural racism. And it presents an anti-racist theology that is communal and structural in nature. So how does it do that? Here I want to turn to the structure of this confession. So Belhar's structure is broadly Trinitarian, like the ancient creeds, but it is topically focused on a specific socio-political crisis, which is much more like Barman. So it's a bit of both. It has elements of Barman with the logic of it, but it's also Trinitarian in its overall tone and content. And so in that sense, it has a certain affinity with the Nicene Creed. Internally, it's more modeled after Barman, which in terms of its having both affirmations and rejections in each of the main sections of the confession. It's divided into 6 main parts. There's a article on the Trinity, article on the Church, and then there's 3 large sections with articles on unity, reconciliation, and justice. And then there's a concluding thesis on Jesus as Lord. So turning first to the article on the Trinity. We believe in the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who gathers, protects, and cares for the church through word and spirit. This God has done since the beginning of the world and will do to the end. This opening article places the entire confession within the Catholic faith of the Nicene Creed. Unlike the Nicene and Apostles' creeds, however, Belhar focuses on the work of the triune God on the church rather than on creation. There's no message here about God being the creator of all things seen and unseen. Here it's specifically about God being the one who gathers, protects, and cares for the church. And that doesn't necessarily mean that Belhar rejects that God is the creator, not by any means. Only that this is not an article of faith that Belhar sees as important to insist on, particularly in the context of this status confessionis. We'll see why more, but we already have an idea given the way that the doctrine of creation was used so strongly to support the apartheid regime. Next, on the church, we believe in one holy universal Christian church, the communion of saints, called from the entire human family. This article clarifies what the church that God gathers, protects, and cares for actually is. So what is that church? Well, it's specifically the one holy universal church. It's interesting here to note that Belhar leaves out apostolic. Interestingly, the Barman in its opening appeal said that they were one holy apostolic church. They left out universal. So it's interesting here. So Barman is less interested in unity, universality, and it's more interested in the specific commission, vocation of the church, apostolic. Belhar, by contrast, just the opposite. It's less interested in the apostolic mission and much more interested in unity, bringing communities together. It goes on also to say that the church is called from the entire human family. That's a key phrase that sets up the rest of the confession. If the church is the entire human family, then segregating the church by race is a violation of the church's very identity. Turning now to the first section on unity. The opening article on unity is the longest of the entire confession, in keeping with the fact that unity forms the central theme of Belhar. The first opening affirmation, which I'll read, we believe that Christ's work of reconciliation is made manifest in the church as the community of believers who have been reconciled with God and with one another. This forms kind of the thesis or theme of this entire section. So like both Barman and C67, Belhar says that the church is constituted by Christ's work of reconciliation. And because of that, the church is fundamentally defined by unity. if we have been joined together and constituted by Christ's work of unifying God and humanity, we too should be a people of unity. So unity here is both a gift and an obligation for the Church of Jesus Christ. Unity is both what the church is and how the church should be. The unity has been established through Christ's work, but it also must be actively realized through the working of the Holy Spirit. Christ has already conquered the factors that separate people, and thus the church is obligated to resist anything that threatens the unity of this church. He goes on to say that unity must be made visible, or else it contradicts the message of the church. Our words mean nothing if we proclaim unity but live in manifest disunity. Belhar goes on to give a list of ways that the church ought to manifest unity, including sharing in common worship, participating in each other's lives, and serving the world together. Unity has to be established in freedom, not under compulsion. It cannot be manufactured or artificially constructed. And finally, the unity of Christ and Spirit encompasses the various languages and cultures that characterize human diversity. As a result of this affirmation, it says, therefore, we reject any doctrine which absolutizes either natural diversity or the sinful separation of people in such a way that this absolutization hinders or breaks the visible and active unity of the church, or even leads to the establishment of a separate church formation. The Belhar here rejects all segregation within the church, especially the separation between a dominant sending church and a subordinate mission church, especially when that separation is defined along racial lines. Now, the key term here is natural diversity. Natural diversity goes beyond race and ethnicity. It's more inclusive. It includes any natural differences. And while not the focus of Belhar, we could include here gender, sexuality, disability, and other categories. Belhar doesn't deny that there are natural differences. The issue is the absolutization of those natural differences, as if we are supposed to structure our Christian faith around those differences, rather than to understand those differences in light of our unity in Jesus Christ. So absolutization occurs whenever a creaturely difference is made normative instead of being merely relative. This occurs whenever certain differences are given divine sanction and treated as though being ordained by God. They are not only securely fixed, but they are fixed by God, elevated beyond the realm of the mundane, and absolutized as something eternal. That's the problem that Belhar is trying to identify and reject. The larger issue here is the theological status of diversity, of natural diversity. I mentioned before how the Dutch Reformed Church had a strong doctrine of creation, and by that I meant that they believed that we can read God's will off the face of nature, as if we can look at our natural differences and know that God thereby intends these differences to remain separate and unmixed. So the Dutch Reformed Church had established the category of nature as the definitive basis for understanding what it means to be human. And then they used God's will as the creator to absolutize those natural differences. So the DRC baptized these differences as divinely authorized and made it the church's business to sustain and sanctify those differences. Belhar, by contrast, believes that these natural differences are relativized and redefined in light of what God has done in Christ. Christ is not subordinate to nature, but rather nature is subordinate to Christ. Christ doesn't baptize our differences of nature and culture, but subverts them and challenges us to see where we have turned our social differences into idols and so violated God's call to unity and reconciliation. That's the issue, is have we bought into the ideology of of nature, as opposed to a theology of reconciliation and unity. That absolutization of natural diversity is not unique to the white Dutch churches, of course, as we've already pointed out. This is the same false doctrine that led most white Christians in the United States to believe until fairly recently that miscegenation and racially mixed marriages were a violation of God's law and the natural order. A recent survey showed that still a third of the people in the US still believe this, as shocking as that might be. This was also the same issue that Barth dealt with in the Barmen Declaration. Since the Nazi Christians had made blood and soil, that is their version of nature, the basis for understanding what it means to be human. And then they structured Christianity around their view of blood and soil. So both Barmen and Belhar were written in opposition to a racist theology of the folk that defines the church in terms of racial or cultural factors. Barmen and Belhar both place God's revelation and reconciliation in Christ over against cultural factors that would bind God's word to a particular nation or ethnic racial identity. At the end of the section on unity, Belhar rejects any doctrine that maintains that dissent or any other human or social factor should be a consideration in determining membership of the church. Belhar here addresses one of the major failings of Barmen. While Barmen succeeded in defending the church from the German state's attempt to decide who could serve in the church, it failed to take up the issue of the Jewish people and the particular status of the Jews in the German people. Belhar addresses that by, as fully as it can, by stating that any matter of dissent is completely irrelevant to the church. Now, this goes beyond Barmen, which did not say anything about dissent or ethnicity directly, but only said that the state must not infringe upon the commission and vocation of the church. So Barmen just wanted to keep the freedom of the church to fulfill its vocation. By contrast, Belhar specifically says that matters of dissent or ethnicity are irrelevant to the church. So here it's more clear that a racially or ethnically divided or defined church is in violation of the gospel, regardless of what the state does. Also, it's also worth pointing out here that the fact that Belhar says not just dissent, but any other human or social factor. There is a broader, much larger horizon in view here that goes beyond issues of race and ethnicity to a number of other social factors. And that's kind of what gives Belhar further added relevance and significance for the church today. Turning now to reconciliation. So we believe here that God has entrusted the church with the message of reconciliation in and through Jesus Christ. That's the opening thesis here within this article. This second section says that the church has been given the message of reconciliation. Much like Confession of 67, Belhar moves from what God has done, which is reconcile the world in Christ, to what the church must do, that is, be ambassadors of reconciliation. Because God has conquered the powers of sin and death, as it says, and therefore also of irreconciliation and hatred, it follows that the church is supposed to, quote, live in a new obedience, which can open new possibilities of life for society and the world. Belhar here goes beyond the church-state distinction of Barmen to encompass all of society and the world. In addition, the church is called to be a peacemaker and to witness both by word and by deed to the new heaven and new earth in which righteousness dwells. The truth of the gospel is also called into question, as it says, when it is proclaimed in a land which professes to be Christian, but in which the enforced separation of people on a racial basis promotes and perpetuates alienation, hatred, and enmity. Here is the first direct mention of race in the confession. And it's also worth noting that this here we see a critique of Christian nationalism, or at least the hypocrisy of Christian nationalism as it's actually practiced. A land which professes to be Christian. Here, Belhar is pointing out the deep irony of a place like South Africa, in which separation has been enforced, despite its claims to be about unity and peace and justice. Belhar says that any teaching that legitimates racist segregation by appealing to the gospel must be considered ideology and false doctrine. That leads us to the rejection. Therefore, we reject any doctrine in such a situation sanctions in the name of the gospel or of the will of God the forced separation of people on the grounds of race and color, and thereby in advance obstructs and weakens the ministry and experience of reconciliation in Christ. Here, Belhar forcefully rejects any doctrine that forces the separation of people on the grounds of race and color in the name of God. So Belhar rejects any theologically grounded segregation as a heretical violation of the gospel. Belhar thus names here, it names racism as a theological heresy. And so where racism has been justified on theological grounds, there we have a status confessionis, a matter that requires a confession because it calls into question whether the church is really the Church of Jesus Christ. That brings us now to the third section on justice. The third article is a profound and prophetic declaration that the God of the Bible is the God of justice. God has revealed God's self as the one who wishes to bring about justice and true peace among people. Here, what follows is a list of other affirmations about God, and I'll read some of these here. So, God is in a special way the God of the destitute, the poor, and the wronged. God brings justice to the oppressed and gives bread to the hungry. God frees the prisoner, supports the downtrodden, protects the stranger. God wishes to teach the church to do what is good and to seek the right. Turning to the church, therefore, must witness against and strive against any form of injustice, so that justice may roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. The church must stand where the Lord stands, namely against injustice and with the wronged. The church must witness against all the powerful and the privileged. So these statements recognize that God stands opposed to structural injustice. Notice the breadth of these statements. This is no longer limited to anything specific like race or ethnicity. Any kind of injustice, any kind of broader social structural injustice is here rejected as opposed to God. The words used here, the wronged, the oppressed, the privileged, refer to systems of power, not to individual acts of good or evil. So as a result, Belhar stands with liberation theologians in condemning structures of oppression and declaring God's preferential option for the poor, to borrow a famous phrase from liberation theology. And therefore, we reject any ideology which would legitimate forms of injustice and any doctrine which is unwilling to resist such an ideology in the name of the gospel. Notice that instead of doctrine here, which was used in the previous sections, and now it says ideology. further highlighting that the position being rejected here is not a genuine doctrine at all, but an idea, an ideology that has infiltrated the church and corrupted its message. This leads us finally to the conclusion. We believe that in obedience to Jesus Christ, its only head, the church is called to confess and to do all these things, even though the authorities and human laws might forbid them, and punishment and suffering be the consequence. Jesus is Lord. Jesus alone is Lord, and therefore no human leader is Lord over the church. The church is therefore called to follow God in the path of unity, reconciliation, and justice, even if this violates human laws and authorities. God's law here supersedes all human laws. This is a point that is perhaps implicit in Barman, but not fully stated there. And so Belhar here is amplifying it and making more explicit the point that if Jesus is Lord, then this might mean disobeying the government. Civil disobedience, or in case of faithful disobedience, is called for when the laws of the state are in violation of God's justice. There's also an accompanying letter to the Confession of Belhar, which is important, and so be sure to read that letter from the DRMC. I mentioned that at the start of this lecture. This letter clarifies that the confession was undertaken because the heart of the gospel is so threatened as to be at stake, that the truth and power of the gospel is threatened in this situation. The confession is not written against a specific group of people, as I've pointed out already, but a specific doctrine, namely a false doctrine and an ideological distortion of the gospel. The authors also confess their sin in not doing more to witness to the gospel. Also an important point that even these churches that are calling for this change recognize their complicity in all of this. The letter also says that we are only too well aware that this confession calls for the dismantling of structures of thought, of church, and of society, which have developed over many years. This is the one explicit place where the idea of structural injustice is mentioned. So that's why it's a very important point that comes out in this letter and clarifies exactly what is in view in the confession itself. So the authors of Belhar do recognize that the problem is structural and requires a structural solution. It's going to take a long time. It's going to require many years of changing thought, changing the church, and changing society itself. Finally, I want to turn to looking at Barman, Belhar, and the PCUSA today. So the PCUSA established a special committee on Belhar in 2013. It eventually adopted Belhar as part of its Book of Confessions in 2016. Alongside the DRMC letter, which was written in 1982, the special committee added their own accompanying letter in 2013. And I've included that letter in our readings for this week. So please read that as well. And Belhar has only become more relevant in the years since it was adopted, both adopted by the South African Church, but also by the PCUSA. The same year that the special committee wrote their letter on the relevance of Belhar to the US context, that same year, Black Lives Matter was founded in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. And of course, police killings and racial injustice are a constant feature of American society. White supremacist groups have become more prominent in recent years, and hate crimes have increased. And of course, our churches remain as segregated as ever. And all that kind of raises the larger question, basically, where is the American version of the Belhar Confession? As we saw earlier in this course, Presbyterianism in this country was deeply implicated in the history of colonialism and slavery. And the leading theologians and church leaders of the day justified those practices on the basis of a spiritualized gospel that separated the salvation of the soul from the pursuit of justice. These false doctrines later legitimated Jim Crow racism, and today they are used to justify mass incarceration and the oppressive policies of the American empire. So there ought to have been a Belhar-like confession in the United States in the 19th century, like denouncing slavery as a heresy, but there wasn't, to our shame. Slavery was not just America's original sin, it was a massive status confessionis in which American Christianity failed to be the confessing church and largely proved themselves to be a false church. The racial injustice, it was not just a political problem, it was a theological problem within the American church. And it continues to be a status confessionis from slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration. So we must learn from Barman and Belhar what it means to be a confessing church today. It may not mean writing our own confession necessarily. We do now thankfully have Belhar that we can embrace, but it does raise the question: why wasn't this ever? Why don't we have such a document already in our Book of Confessions? And so to learn a little bit more from Barman and Belhar, just to kind of reiterate and focus what we can take away here, Barman challenges the church to resist efforts to co-opt Christianity for the purposes of nationalism and authoritarianism. It calls us to follow Christ alone, to the rejection of all other powers and principalities. Belhar challenges the church to do more than preach a gospel of justice. It calls us to live the gospel of justice, to place our bodies at the service of God's creation of a new humanity defined by unity, reconciliation, and justice. And both Barman and Belhar challenge us to reject all natural theology, all false doctrines that attempt to sanctify and baptize what is supposedly natural or cultural, as if these are divinely blessed and ordained. We might also think about how, say, the gender binary and heterosexuality have been likewise considered divinely ordained because they are supposedly, although not actually, natural. Barman and Belhar were of course not written within or for the American context, and so they challenge the U.S. church in a couple ways. First, they challenge us not to absolve ourselves from the crimes and sins that took place in Germany and South Africa. There's a tendency to view Nazis and German Christians as somehow subhuman, people who abandoned any humanity and became monsters. We also likewise, talk about apartheid as some great evil that, of course, we would never have done. And so that tendency can blind us to our own sins. So when we entertain those notions of them being the other, those heinous others who are far worse than we are, we can be blind to our sin as if they were a special case to which we are not prone. And in doing so, we just protect ourselves and don't scrutinize the ways that we have also been complicit in great structural evil. Secondly, though, they challenge us to think long and hard about what it might mean to confess the gospel within our American context. There have been other examples of this, of course. Very recently, in fact, there were some declarations that were written in response to some of these issues. There was a theological declaration on Christian faith and white supremacy that was written in response to the white nationalist rally in Charlottesville in 2017. There was also that same year the Boston Declaration, which was a response to American racism, nationalism, and militarism. These were both spurned on in response to the election of Donald Trump and the events that took place in the wake of all that. Now, both of these were not specifically reform documents, nor were they officially sanctioned by any church. but they represent a theology consistent with Belhar and Barman, certainly in their spirit and also in this larger same theological vein. The question then, that comes to us is: do we face a status confessionis today? And what would it mean to be the confessing church in our time right now? What would that look like? I want to conclude now by reading some passages from the letter from the PCUSA special committee that accompanies the Belhar Confession. And this will be the conclusion to this lecture and to this course in terms of the materials that we have been covering. So, Belhar asks us to look first at ourselves when faced with church division, rather than moving quickly to blaming those with whom we are separated. It is far too easy to look at the other and blame them for division. Belhar directs us to look at our own behavior that has led to disunity. What is the log in our own eye? The Confession of Belhar calls us to renew the covenant, to embrace one another as members of one family of God. Jesus Christ calls us to a costly discipleship of dying to ourselves so that we might allow his light to shine through us as a witness into the darkness of our world. Some will no doubt say that the Presbyterian Church USA already has confessions for the reasons identified herein and more. But we say that these are unique times in the United States of America. The winds of polarization blow strong and threaten the body politic as never before. There is a not so subtle, dangerous intermingling of God and nation that makes discerning the difference between the two difficult. Historic Reformed theological values are under constant attack. The forces of evil tempt followers of Christ to walk in the spirit of disunity, conflict, and injustice. As we claim the church's earliest confession, Jesus is Lord, we put on notice every principality and power that the only sovereign in heaven and on earth is on the move. So in closing, I encourage you to demonstrate the prophetic witness of Barman and Belhar in your own church communities and to be ambassadors of the God who is on the move to bring about justice in this world.